Welcome in to Cincinnati Bengals Talk. I'm James Rapien and joined by voice of the Bengals, Dan Hoard. Make sure you check out the Bengals Booth podcast, all free agency, all off season long as well, whether it's draft, your NFL combine coverage was obviously awesome, Dan. So I appreciate you taking some time. And let's start with free agency because it seems like over the past just couple of days, the tight end market has shifted a little bit. And now everyone's looking to the past to potentially answer the Bengals' issues at tight end with Hayden Hurst and CJ Uzama. The safety market continues to change. But when you look at this roster, what do you think the Bengals' biggest priority will be when the legal tampering period starts on Monday?
Defensive tackle. I don't think there's anything that indicates that isn't the number one priority in free agency. The problem is, I don't love the class, James. I know everybody is kind of like focused in on a few guys, and there are certainly some players that would help, but they don't necessarily fit the model of what the Bengals have done best in free agency, and that is get guys in their mid-20s on their second contract who are ascending. Those are the ones that have been great free agents in Cincinnati. So we're talking about Trey Hendrickson. We're talking about Mike Hilton, Von Bell, numerous guys. DJ Reader fit that description. When I look at this defensive tackle market, Christian Wilkins fits that description. A lot of people seem to think that he's not going to be in their price range, and maybe that's the case. But if we've learned anything about the Bengals in free agency over the last few years, it's forget everything you ever thought was true about the Bengals because it's all changed. At this time last year, if you were doing podcasts about free agency, every single person that you would have talked to would have said, oh, there's no way they can sign Orlando Brown Jr. He's going to be too expensive, right? Every single person,
Right.
no
Doubt.
exceptions. So for every single person out there that says Christian Wilkins isn't a possibility, they're probably right, but they're not definitely right. So I do think they're going to address defensive tackle in free agency, but I would just say, don't hop on a couple of names that you think are most likely because we really don't know.
I do think that the defensive tackle class, if you just look at the names, it feels deep. But you're right, the profile of guys, a lot of these guys
Right.
are 30, are pushing 30. And even Christian Wilkins is 28. And that isn't old, by the way, just for
Right.
those wondering. But it is from what they've targeted and had success with. And so I do wonder, like I see Tier Tart last year was really weird with him, but he is
Yes.
27, fits their profile. But is that the answer? I don't know. I do think it's interesting how they handle that. And then also handle a guy like DJ Reader, who would be near the top of this class if he were healthy. And I have no idea what his market is.
I would sign DJ Reader in a heartbeat. I would have no problem bringing him back despite the injury. He's overcome it once before. I think he'll overcome it again. He's going to be 30 years old. And I do think the injury makes it much more likely, unfortunately for DJ, that he's going to stay in Cincinnati because I do think that it limited his market value. He was probably going to get a 3 or maybe a 4-year deal before the injury. And that probably would have made it impossible for Cincinnati. Because of the injury, it's probably a year or two. And I think the Bengals can probably pay him as much as anybody else is going to be willing to. So I would bring back DJ personally in a heartbeat. And it'll be interesting to see if they do. He's still around. He's been rehabbing here. So I think a lot of signs point to that being a possibility. But again, we never know what another team is willing to offer. So that's always the thing to keep in mind. I'm glad you brought up Tier Tart. He seems to be the flavor of the moment. And I can say this from working with Dave Lapham, the last several times the Bengals have faced the Tennessee Titans, Lap has been effusive in his praise for Tier Tart going into those games. It's always like, Jeffrey Simmons is incredible, but I really like this Tier Tart. And when Lap says something like that, it really resonates with me because he studies the tape. He sees things that we don't pick up on, or maybe Pro Football Focus isn't always the best gauge of. So when Lap likes a guy, I tend to like a guy. But you're right. Last year was strange. Tennessee lets him go late in the season. All of the reports out of Tennessee was, it was due to effort and attitude. You never like to hear that. Now, the Bengals will do their research and determine what was at the bottom of that. Was it related to him wanting to, maximize his value in free agency and not getting as much playing time as he wanted? Based on what I've read, that seemed to be at the heart of the issue. But anytime you hear that a player was let go late in the season for those reasons, it raises red flags that they have to get to the bottom of before they try to sign him as a free agent.
Yeah, it's one of those where will they attack on Monday and will we see, Tierra Tart signs with whoever, or does he come in for a visit and will they have enough time? I don't know. I think his free agency process could be interesting. They did put the waiver claim in for him after the Titans
Correct.
released him and he landed in Houston, like you said. So he's interesting. I agree with you on Reader because there's really no one like Grover Stewart's on the wrong side of 30 and there aren't a ton of nose tackles. And so I think that they need to try to get something done with DJ. And by the way, DJ is a much better player when healthy than a Grover Stewart. So how they attack the defensive tackle room in free agency is the big question. Another big question is right tackle. Let's start with Jonah. Do you see a path for him to return? I really don't. I think his market's going to be pretty big. I think he'll sign elsewhere. But do you think that there's the doors cracked for Jonah Williams to return in free agency?
Probably not. I've kind of assumed in my own mind that he is going to cash in on his versatility that he displayed last year and become one of the higher paid free agents in this class. And that's okay. He was a very solid Bengal, certainly an above average starting tackle, no matter which side you put him on, at least when he was fully healthy. But I do think all signs point to him playing somewhere else next year. And let's see if the Bengals can get a more prototypical right tackle going forward. Certainly, there are a bunch of them in this draft. And depending who's still there at 18, that could be the direction that the Bengals go.
I think that's the interesting dynamic with tackle is the draft loaded, especially
Mm-hmm.
early on, first round. Free agency, not so much. I think it gets pretty thin pretty quickly, especially at right tackle. At the same time, I do think they'll add a veteran, don't you? That they have to add someone at that spot.
Absolutely. I think they're going to add somebody who could start if need be. And keep in mind, a lot of people seem to think there are probably 6 to 8 first round tackles in this draft. At the top of that list, I think you would have a definitive plug and play starter at right tackle. But if 6 of them are gone and the Bengals were to draft number 7 or 8, is that guy a plug and play, or is he more of somebody that's going to need a little bit of, developmental work? I know you heard Greg Cosell on my most recent podcast, who's obviously extremely well connected in NFL circles, and just specifically talking about Amarius Mims, a guy who has frequently been mock draft to Cincinnati. Greg said, I don't think he's a year one starter. I think he's going to be potentially a great NFL player, but he might not be a guy who's ready to start in week 1 in the NFL this year with 8 college starts under his belt. So I do think you need to have somebody that's potentially your starting right tackle, even if you take one in round 1.
Totally agree. I think just giving yourself an established guy that can do it. If Brock
Right.
Bowers is there at 18, or if Quinyon Mitchell is there at 18, or one of these guys that you don't necessarily expect to fall happens to fall because there's a run on tackles, you don't want to have to reach for that next tier.
Yeah, the other thing to keep in mind too is that the Bengals were extremely lucky this past season in that their 5 starting offensive linemen were able to start every game. The odds of that happening in back-to-back seasons, unfortunately, are slim and none. At some point this year, a Bengals offensive lineman won't be able to start a game. Hopefully, it's nothing, that's going to cost a guy a season or half a season, but a game or two here and there, it's almost a certainty. So you better have a swing tackle that you really like as somebody that can step up and start a few games if that's not your guy that you expect to start all year at right tackle.
Dan, I think everyone sort of agrees from a need standpoint. It's defensive tackle, it's right tackle, and then there's a bunch of other needs. And depending on whose list you look at, it might be safety, it might be tight end. Others may say running back. What would be next on your list from a free agency standpoint for the Bengals?
I don't think there's any question that they're going to sign a safety. The
Mhm.
question is this somebody that is going to be a starter? Many people seem to think in place of Dax Hill. I don't believe that personally. I think the demonizing of Dax Hill after last season has gone way above and beyond the reality of how he
Glad you're
played.
saying
And
this.
what's that?
Yeah. I'm glad you're saying this. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
way above and beyond the reality of his play and also what the Bengals think about him. Now, there's so many good safeties out there right now in free agency. Jeffrey Simmons is the latest one to be added to the list. I mean, if somehow a tremendous Pro Bowl level safety falls into their lap, then that could change everything. But Dax Hill is not like the reason why the Bengals defense wasn't as good as we expected it to be last year. He didn't have a great year. I understand that. But let's just take PFF ratings as an example. If you look at his PFF ranking last year, it was almost identical to Jesse Bates' PFF ranking the year the Bengals went to the Super Bowl. At that position, the rankings fluctuate wildly. Jesse
Mhm.
Bates had two really bad PFF rated seasons in his 5 years in Cincinnati. And that's not to say that Jesse Bates, had a wildly inconsistent tenure in Cincinnati, but it does say at that position, for whatever reason, I do think the ratings fluctuate. I am not out on Dax Hill by any stretch of the imagination. I think his problems are fixable. I think the Bengals still believe in him. Now, they do need to add a safety, preferably an experienced one that can help the room. Probably somebody that would replace Nick Scott and probably play a little bit more than Nick did later in the season. But it seems to me that like Dax Hill has become this target that of the 11 guys on defense, he was the one that really struggled and caused all these problems. And I don't think that's the case at all.
Yeah, I mentioned shortly after the season, like he's a couple dropped interceptions away from 110 tackles and 5 interceptions. You take a better angle on George Pickens, and things just feel different, even if they aren't that much different. And I know the Bengals don't view it that way, and there are
Mm-hmm.
things that Dax needs to improve at, but it wasn't that far off from being at least a solid starting year for him in his first year starting. At the same time, you're right about the safety market. It's like the opposite of defensive tackle. There are a
Correct.
bunch of guys in their mid-20s that are
Yes,
just gonna be out there like, "Hey, yeah, I'll go battle for the starting job in Cincinnati and try to win a ring." So I do think that
100%.
they could accidentally stumble, not even accidentally, but just stumble into value that they wouldn't necessarily anticipate, and that wasn't there last year when they signed Nick Scott.
Totally agree. That's the position this year that I think you almost can't go wrong if you're looking one for one in free agency because so many of these guys fit the description of what we were talking about at the beginning of this podcast. They are getting ready for their second contract. They are in their mid 20s and they've played well. Geno Stone is a popular name that a lot of people have raised. I would be worried if I were a Bengals fan about the possibility of him following Mike McDonald to Seattle. That totally makes sense to me. He was his defensive coordinator in Baltimore. They just let Adams go. Seattle clearly has a need at that position. I could easily see that happening. So he's a guy that might not be out there, but I mean, I've got some names in front of me. Cameron Curls in his mid 20s with 4 years of experience under his belt. Xavier McKinney played really well. He's in his mid 20s with one contract under his belt. He's had some injury problems, but there are a lot of guys like that that I think are in their mid 20s, one contract in, pretty accomplished at the NFL level that would fit exactly what the Bengals need.
And we go from strength in free agency to another position that the Bengals they don't have anyone at right now, and I do think they'll bring back Drew Sample at tight end and potentially re-sign Tanner Hudson, maybe even Mitch Wilcox. But I do think that they would like in a perfect world to add a veteran tight end. And after Dalton Schultz signed, it's pretty much Noah Fant, Hunter Henry, and then it gets lean pretty quick. Obviously, Hayden Hurst and CJ Uzama hit the market earlier this week.
You a Mike Gesicki guy?
I am. I don't know if they are because he
Yeah.
just kind of hung out there last year. I would be open to it, especially because I think he has to sign like an Irv Smith Jr. type deal. Like, I don't think he's going to have much of a market, maybe that changes because of the lack of veterans. But yeah, I would
Yeah.
be in. I think he's a
Of
talented pass catcher.
of the names that you mentioned, I would put him on the list. Now, these are all guys that are around 30 or 31 years old. So again, it's not that second contract in his mid to slightly older than that 20s. Noah Fant would be the guy that fits that description. So if you could do it, I think they would be interested, but that's going to take up a big chunk of your free agent budget. And I do think defensive tackle is a bigger priority. Can they get by with another 1 year, let Joe Burrow elevate his value, let James Casey work with the guy free agent? Sure. It worked really well with Hayden Hurst. It didn't work well with Irv Smith Jr., but that doesn't mean that it's a terrible strategy. You just have to find the right guy. I think they would love to draft one. Brock Bowers would be a fantasy. I don't think he's going to be there at 18, but he's not the only tight end in this draft. He's just the only name that we've learned at this point. There are other good ones out there. I could very easily see them taking a guy sometime in the first few rounds. But even if they do that, supplementing it with a veteran on a short-term deal is probably a pretty wise move.
Ben Sinnott from Kansas
That's
State.
your
That
guy?
would be one. It's still early to say my guy, but he's certainly on the radar, the day 2 radar of tight ends.
Yeah,
Because
Sanders from Texas. His name comes
yep,
up. Sinnott is a possibility. There are guys out there, and certainly it's been a while since they've used a fairly high draft pick on a tight end. Um, it didn't work out last year. They had a lot of those guys that were probably like the next pick on their board when it came time to choose somebody, and it just didn't work out. But I do think with 2 extra picks this year, there's probably a pretty good chance that a tight end will be on that list at some point.
let's stick with the offense and transition to running back, which running back's so unique because this year I don't think we had a couple of first rounders last year in the draft. I don't think we're going to have any first round running backs in the draft this year, but it's loaded in free agency with a bunch of big names. And I don't know who has what left. You know, some of the guys down the middle in the middle of the pack that meet with the Bengals are looking for mid-20s and all of those things might go for a 1-year type deal, prove it type deal. How do you think they view running back from Joe Mixon, Chase Brown, what they have on the roster to maybe going in free agency, but they could also just wait till the draft because I do like rounds 2 through 5. I think there's going to be a lot of good running backs available.
I'd rather draft one personally. I mean, one of the reasons why a lot of people are saying it's time to let Joe Mixon go is the wear and tear. So why spend on somebody else with wear and tear?
Mhm.
I like young, fresh legs at that position. And if you look at the Bengals' history, second round running back is where they've hit it out of the park, whether it's Joe Mixon most recently or Corey Dillon historically. That's where they tend to find their running back that's going to be the guy that gets the ball for 4 or 5 straight years. So I'm not necessarily saying it's second round this year, but second, third, somewhere in that neighborhood. I think that that's a really strong possibility as well. I would rather go draft than free agency when it comes to supplementing that position.
Yeah, I think they could, and they did this with Giovanni Bernard in 2013. Second round running back, first running back off the board. That could be the case at 49 this year if they wanted a running back there. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not saying they will,
Yeah,
but they could easily be in position to take the top running back in their favorite if they want to.
correct. And if it's not the first, it's going to be one of the top few. If they
Yeah.
use a second round pick on a running back, it would probably be one of the top 3 running backs off the board. So that was the case with Joe Mixon. I think he was the 3rd or 4th running back in his draft. Certainly one of the top running backs in that draft. So I think that that's a real possibility. And I think Chase Brown is going to get a lot more work this year than he did last year. So that position is going to get an infusion of youth.
Speaking of youth, and Joe Burrow made some recent comments to Ben Baby about youth, and it's something we've talked about. Everyone knows it, that the Miles Murphys of the world, the DJ Turner, Stax Hills, all of
Mm-hmm.
these guys are going to have a bigger role. They need them to have a bigger role and be productive. the Bengals have been in a unique spot over the past couple of years when they're drafting. They there hasn't been the obvious, oh, this guy's going to come in and start right away. They haven't needed that. They've just been deep enough. This year, they're banking on some of those guys to have increased roles. How bullish are you on the early picks of the past couple of drafts that the Bengals are going to be relying on as starters most likely this year?
Really bullish on a few. Jordan Battle at the top of the list. I thought he was awesome as a rookie. I think he's going to be a cornerstone player on their defense going forward. DJ Turner looked like he was going to be that type of guy early last year and then faded as the season went along. Hopefully, he's able to string it together for, more than 10 or 11 games as he gets bigger and stronger and more experienced in the NFL. Miles Murphy's a real question mark. He had his moments, especially late in the season. I don't think anybody saw a Pro Bowl level future pass rusher based on his play, but he's so young. He didn't get a ton of snaps, and I do think he's ascending. So I'm bullish on him as well. I just think we would all like to see it come a little bit more quickly than it did. But he's an interesting guy. Everybody at the end of last season seemed to say, well, man, that they could have had one of these great tight ends instead of him. Well, those tight ends were not first-round draft picks on their draft board, and Miles Murphy was. So if you believe in the strategy of do what your board tells you to do, then the Bengals obeyed that strategy. Maybe Miles Murphy isn't as great of an NFL player going forward as Sam Laporta turns out to be. We'll see. But on their board, Miles Murphy had a significantly higher grade than Sam Laporta. So if that's what your study tells you to do, then you stick with your board and hope that ultimately you get it right.
They were just manifesting Brock Bowers in 2020. That's all that was. That's all.
Future planning. This guy is going to be there next year. We'll have the 18th pick in the draft. He's going to somehow slip through the cracks and he'll be our guy. Maybe that's the way it turns out.
Yeah, if it does, well, you've heard it long before here, so I can't say you've heard it here first, but you've heard it. So we'll see if Brock Bowers lands there. He's Dan Hoard, the radio voice of the Bengals. Make sure you check out the Bengals Booth podcast wherever you get your podcast. Dan, appreciate the time. Thank you for coming on.
James, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.